Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more History Matters. This time, why didn't Canada join the American Revolution? Short animated documentary by History Matters. Before we dive in, though, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you joined the Discord and followed me over at Twitch. All right, why didn't Canada join the American Revolution? I believe we've watched a video that has talked about this, at least briefly, and I can't remember. I can't remember the reason why. You would at least think that maybe the Quebecois, uh, the French in Quebec, would in that area would want to, join and fight the English, but I guess not. I mean, I know an American army definitely marched all the way up to Montreal, I believe, and was pushed back. But that was more so out of an effort to unite, to take as part of the American Revolution, bring Canada as part of it to completely kick out the British. But why didn't the Canadian bourgeoisie join the American bourgeoisie? Go ahead and find out, shall we?
When the American War for Independence broke out, 13 of Britain's North American colonies opted to sever ties with the mother country. However, some of those colonies chose to remain loyal and afterwards would go on to form the Dominion of Canada. Thus the question is, why didn't Canada join the American Revolution? Before continuing, it's important to stress that in 1775, Canada didn't exist. It was instead comprised of the colonies of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Quebec, Rupert's Land and St. John's Island. Barring Quebec, the differences between the peoples of these states and those of the 13 colonies were no more or less stark. Before it can be determined why all of the colonies didn't leave, it's necessary to know why the 13 that did leave chose to break away in the first
The bourgeoisie
place. Much of the anger directed at Britain was due to the idea that the recent acts of King George III and his parliament violated the rights of Englishmen. This is why the province of Quebec had no interest in revolting, since, it wasn't English. Speaking of Quebec, it was itself one of the reasons for the revolution. The Quebec Act had expanded the size of the French-speaking colony and granted freedom of religion there, which to the Protestant English-speaking colonies surrounding them was terrible. For Quebec, its options were to stay with Britain, whom they didn't exactly like but had granted them rights and more territory, or to the rebels who despised them. But what about when the French began to help the Americans? Didn't Quebec want to go back to being under French rule? Well, no. Being a British colony gave Quebec access to a much larger international trading market, and also, to put it bluntly, the French didn't really care about it anymore. Another reason for the American Rebellion is what are known as the Intolerable Acts. Things like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and the Quartering Act took away rights and privileges that American colonists had previously held, which shockingly upset them. The taxes that Britain imposed were done so without the consent of the Americans, leading to cries of no taxation without representation, to which Britain's response was, the people living in Britain itself barely have representation, so what makes you so special?
Yeah, fair. One thing that I also want to add is really by the point, so the reason that the Intolerable Acts led to such a massive outcry amongst the American elite, because let's be real here, the American Revolution is a revolution of the elite class and not of the common class. This was the people in power being upset that they were having to pay more. The trend in American history, isn't it, huh? But essentially, Britain was very hands-off with the American colonies. And so to the American colonies, right, they had gone like 200 years, really, about 100, 200 years, without Britain really enforcing anything on them. So it's not like it was just like, it was not like they were around for like just a couple decades or something, and they had not, and this freedom that they had been experiencing or whatever was not a new thing, and then Britain was taken away. It was a thing that they essentially had from the beginning, and that their ancestors would be, their grandparents would be telling them as children, like, talking about the freedoms that they had or fucking whatever, right? This was something that essentially was in their culture was their essential freedom from the from direct British rule. They were British subjects, but they weren't heavy-handedly being ruled by them. Now, I believe, and part of the reason why Canada also did not join is that the Canadian colonies, I think they were younger. I can't remember. But I don't believe they had the same access to freedom that the American 13 colonies had. My dogs are barking. We'll wait. Okay, they're done barking. And then the other gains that the British have, Florida, where they got that from the Spanish, and then all the former French land. The reason, those didn't join is because they had been ruled by different countries that had not given them that freedom. So, it was something it was something pretty much unique, an experience that the 13 American colonies had, that really no other of the British colonies had, at least from what I'm remembering. Yeah.
Also, mass financial problems across the colonies combined with the ban on expanding westward in order to prevent...
And then also, that annoyed them too. They're like, we fought this war for that land. Why aren't we getting it?
...war with the Indians meant that revolution wasn't too far away. Some of these acts, combined with economic issues, negatively affected the peoples of the later Canadian colonies just as badly.
And then also, more on the economic thing, is that because Britain was so offhanded in their rule of the 13 colonies, the 13 colonies essentially were able to trade with the entire world, not just Britain. So whereas, as he mentioned with the Quebec colony, they had greater access to the global economy by joining the British and not being a part of the French. The 13 colonies, however, had access to the global economy, including the English, and then the outside of the English system as well. And so they got a taste of what true free trade may look like. That also plays a part.
Unlike the 13 colonies, though, the reaction wasn't quite as fierce there. In places like Rupert's Land and St. John's Island, the acts weren't quite as important since their economies relied on natural resource extraction. Whereas in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, the acts were just as disruptive. These colonies did see some resistance to British policies. Nova Scotia had close ties to New England, and much of its population were immigrants from there. Thus, they too were angry at the new taxes, and this anger culminated in a couple of riots, but ultimately no more than that. Much of this was down to the province being much less urbanised, and so what little resistance there was couldn't be organised quickly. Nova Scotia's economy was also reliant on the British military, since Halifax was a garrison town which played host to many Royal Navy vessels. Another factor which secured their allegiance was that British troops were needed to fight off Indian raiding. Speaking of which, raiding by American privateers during the war drastically soured the relationship between Nova Scotia and the 13 rebelling colonies and guaranteed further that Nova Scotia would remain loyal to Britain. As for Newfoundland, many of its residents were fishermen who had either relocated from Britain recently or were there for a season to work, and thus inclusion in the British Empire was necessary for their livelihoods. Whilst Newfoundland had many problems similar to those in the American colonies, its distance meant that it lacked a sense of solidarity with those to its south. Thus, they...
To be fair, there really wasn't much solidarity amongst Americans either, and let's be more fair, there really isn't much solidarity between Americans to this day.
Saw themselves not as colonists, but as being entirely British, and most there believed that their problems would not be solved by political separation. There were two other important reasons for Nova Scotia and Newfoundland remaining loyal. The first was that the elites of the colonies hadn't lost any money from Britain's actions, like those in, say, Virginia or Massachusetts. They were mostly naval officers whose income came from their own lands back in Britain and whose position relied on loyalty. Reason number two was a simple one. Proximity. It was quicker to sail to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia than any of the American colonies, meaning that any retaliation that did happen would have hit them first, and that was not a tantalising proposition for them. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you.
Yet again, History Matters does a great job of providing surprising amount of detail in such a short amount of time. I just can't get enough of them. I love it, and I love their dry humor. Their animation style is unique. I like it. It's comedic, while also still being capable. They are comedic and able to be serious all in one. It's great. And so that was Why Didn't Canada Join the American Revolution, a short animated documentary by History Matters. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.